The bank manager looked me up and down, my worn jacket, my scuffed shoes, my tired eyes, then glanced down at the check in her hand. $10 million. She laughed. Then, without a single word of explanation, she tore the check in half, dropped the pieces into the trash can beside her desk, and told me to leave. I hadn't slept well for 3 years. That wasn't a complaint. It was simply the truth of what the work had asked of me. Late nights hunched over a second monitor in the kitchen while the rest of the apartment stayed dark and quiet, coffee gone cold beside the keyboard. The only sound the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling into itself. I had chosen the kitchen deliberately. It was the farthest room from my daughter's bedroom, and if I was going to be up late into the night, the least I could do was keep the noise away from her. The project had started as a contract, a mid-sized engagement with a technology firm out of Boston, the kind of work I had done a dozen times before. Encryption architecture, layered access controls, the kind of invisible infrastructure nobody thinks about until it fails. And then everyone does. But somewhere in the second month, I had found something the client hadn't asked for. A fundamental flaw in the way the system handled credential handoffs between servers. A quiet vulnerability, the kind that sat dormant for years before someone with the right knowledge and the wrong intentions found it. I had flagged it. Then I had fixed it. Then I had rebuilt the surrounding architecture from the ground up to make sure nothing like it could happen again. And the client had not fully understood what I'd done until their legal team reviewed it. Then their board had. Then the language in the contract changed quietly, without fanfare, from a flat engagement fee to a royalty structure tied to the system's commercial licensing. I had signed the revised agreement without making a fuss about it. I was tired. I had work to do. I didn't think much about the number attached to my name until years later. An envelope arrived at my apartment with a check inside it for $10 million. I'd read it twice. Then I had set it on the kitchen counter, made myself a cup of coffee, and read it again. The amount was printed clearly. My name was printed clearly. The issuing company's name and routing information were printed clearly. Everything that was supposed to be there was there. I put on the same jacket I always wore, a dark navy thing slightly frayed at the left cuff that I had bought several years ago and never replaced because it still did the job, and drove to the bank. It was a branch I had used for nearly a decade. I knew the layout, the row of teller windows on the left, the cluster of desks along the right wall where the customer service staff sat, the small waiting area near the entrance with a pair of upholstered chairs that were slightly too low to be comfortable. I had deposited paychecks there, transferred money for my daughter's school fees there, and once sat at one of those desks to dispute a transaction charge that turned out to be my own mistake. The branch was familiar to me in the way unremarkable places become familiar. Not fondly, just completely. I took a number and waited. When my number was called, I walked to the desk of a woman I had not worked with before. Her nameplate read, Susan Morgan, branch manager. She was in her mid-40s, and her expression settled into the practiced neutrality of someone who processed transactions for a living. I placed the check on the desk and explained what I needed. A standard deposit along with verification of the issuing account in case the amount triggered a hold. I had brought my identification. I had brought the original contract summary with the company's letterhead and contact information. I had thought about this beforehand. I wanted to make it simple. Susan looked at the check and the neutrality left her face. It was replaced by something harder to name. Not quite suspicion, not yet, but a quality of attention that had sharpened suddenly in a direction I recognized. She looked at the number, then she looked at me, my jacket, my shoes, the slight shadows under my eyes from a week of early mornings. She asked me to wait. She did not step away to make a quiet call. She did not lower her voice. She turned to a colleague at the next desk and spoke with an expression that had by now fully crossed the line into something I had seen before and did not have the energy to pretend I hadn't. I told her calmly that the issuing company was a licensed technology firm headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. I gave her the name. I slid my ID across the desk and told her she was welcome to call the company's accounts payable department directly. I had the number. I was not agitated. I had learned over many years that agitation in moments like this was only ever used against me. Susan said that the check had irregularities. She said this loudly enough that the woman seated 2 chairs away in the waiting area turned her head. A man at the teller window glanced over. I asked her, still quietly, what irregularities she was referring to. She did not answer that question. Instead, she reached into a drawer, produced a small magnifying tool of the kind used to examine document printing, and held it over the check for several seconds in a way that felt less like examination and more like performance. Then she set it down, straightened in her chair, and said that the check showed clear signs of fraud. The branch had gone quiet. Not completely. There was still the background noise of keyboards and the distant sound of someone speaking at the far teller window. But in the immediate vicinity of Susan Morgan's desk, people had stopped what they were doing. I told her again that I had the issuing company's contact information. I told her I was willing to sit there while she made the call. I kept my voice level. I put both hands flat on the desk in front of me, visible and still. Susan Morgan picked up the check, held it for a moment, and then tore it in half. The sound was small, a clean tear, 2 pieces. She set them on the edge of her desk, then dropped them into the trash can beside it. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said. Nobody in the branch said anything. Not the colleague who had come to look, not the woman in the waiting area, not the man who had turned from the teller window. They all went back to what they were doing or looked at their phones. Others found something on the ceiling that required their attention. I looked at the trash can, then I reached down into it, picked up both halves of the check, folded them once, and put them in my jacket pocket. I picked up my ID from the desk. I picked up the contract summary. I didn't say anything. I walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped outside into the gray morning air. But what I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that a man had been standing near the back of the branch for the past several minutes, holding a paper cup of coffee he had not yet drunk, watching everything. The man had arrived at the branch unannounced, as he sometimes did with the locations under his oversight, and he had been waiting for a moment to speak with someone on staff when the interaction at Susan Morgan's desk had pulled his attention and held it. His name was Robert Thompson. He was the regional director for the bank's network of branches across the northeastern corridor, which meant that every decision made inside this building, every hire, every policy, every action taken at every desk fell within his area of authority. He stood at the back of the branch with his untouched coffee and watched me walk out the door. Then he set the cup down on the nearest surface, reached into his jacket for his phone, and started making calls. There was a bench on the sidewalk half a block from the bank. The kind of bench that existed not because anyone had thought carefully about where people might want to sit, but because the city had placed it there, and there it remained. I sat down on it. I didn't take out my phone. I didn't call anyone. I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the street in front of me, the slow movement of cars, a woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk, a delivery driver double parked with his hazard lights going. The folded halves of the check were in my jacket pocket. I could feel the slight pressure of them against my ribs. 3 years, that was the arithmetic of it. 3 years of late nights in the kitchen, of a contract that had quietly become something larger than I'd expected, of work that had mattered in ways that most people in that branch would never know and would not have believed if I'd told them. The Boston firm's encryption system now protected the financial data of several 100,000 users. It had been audited by 2 independent security firms and passed both. The licensing agreement had generated, in the time since I had signed it, a sum that required the kind of paperwork that came with its own legal team. None of that had been visible to Susan Morgan. What had been visible was my jacket. What stayed with me, sitting on that bench, was not the humiliation of the moment itself, though that was there, settled low in my chest like something swallowed wrong. What stayed with me was the room. The way the room had simply continued. The colleague who had come over and then gone back to her desk. The woman in the waiting area who had turned her head and then found something else to look at. The man at the teller window. All those people who had watched a check get torn in half and a man get asked to leave and had decided, each of them individually and all of them together, that it was not their moment to speak. I had stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. That did not make it smaller. After a while, I got up from the bench and walked back to my car. Robert Thompson did not operate on instinct. He had spent enough years in institutional finance to know that instinct without documentation was just a feeling, and feelings did not hold up in the kinds of conversations he was about to have. So before he said anything to anyone, he went to work. His first call, made from the branch's back office with the door closed, was to the bank's internal security team. He needed footage from the branch cameras for the past couple of hours, specifically the area around Susan Morgan's desk. The team confirmed they could pull it. He also asked them to capture whatever image they could of the check itself, which had been visible on the desk for several minutes before it was destroyed. And while he waited for that, he made his second call to the bank's document verification unit, a small team that handled exactly these kinds of questions when large instruments came through branches with unusual amounts. He gave them everything he had, the company name I had stated aloud, the approximate routing information he had seen on the check before it was torn, and my name. And he asked them to cross-reference against any known licensing or royalty payments processed through the Boston area in the past fiscal quarter. He had expected this to take most of the day. It took just a couple of hours. The verification unit called him back with a file. David Harlan appeared in their system as the beneficiary of a royalty licensing agreement with a registered technology firm, a firm whose accounts were on record with two major banking institutions, both of which the bank maintained correspondent relationships with. The check amount matched the figure in the licensing ledger exactly. The instrument was not only legitimate, it was, by the standards of commercial documentation, almost unremarkable in its clarity. Robert read through the file twice. Then he called the Boston firm's accounts payable department directly, identified himself, and asked them to confirm the disbursement, and the woman on the other end of the line confirmed it without hesitation. The check had been issued and mailed days earlier, and they had been expecting it to clear soon. He thanked her, ended the call, and sat for a moment with the file open in front of him. Then he asked the branch assistant to let Susan Morgan know he needed to see her. And the meeting took place in the small conference room at the back of the branch, a room used mostly for mortgage consultations and the occasional staff review. Susan came in with the composed expression of someone who had already decided she had done nothing wrong. She sat across from Robert and folded her hands on the table. Robert did not begin with pleasantries. He placed the verification file on the table between them, turned it so she could read it, and told her what it contained. Susan looked at the document. Her composure did not break, but something behind it shifted. A slight tightening around the eyes, a change in the quality of her stillness. She said that she had followed risk management protocol. She said that for instruments above a certain threshold, it was standard practice to apply additional scrutiny. She said the check had presented visual inconsistencies. Robert asked her to specify what those inconsistencies were. She said the paper stock had seemed irregular. He asked whether she had used any verification equipment beyond the handheld magnifier she had produced at her desk. She said she had used her professional judgment. Robert looked at her steadily. Then he said, "If the man who walked in here today had been wearing a different jacket, if he had looked the way you expected someone with a $10 million check to look, would you have torn it?" Susan did not answer, and the file sat on the table between them. Outside the conference room, the branch continued its ordinary business. Keyboards, voices at low volume, the sound of a printer somewhere down the hall. Inside the room, her silence had already answered the question more honestly than any words could have. Robert told her that she was suspended effective immediately, pending a formal review by the bank's human resources and compliance departments. He told her that the grounds for the review would include procedural misconduct and discriminatory conduct toward a customer. He told her to leave her access badge with the front desk on her way out. Susan stood up. For a moment she looked as though she intended to say something further. Then she picked up her bag from the back of the chair, walked to the door, and left without speaking. Robert stayed in the conference room for a moment after she'd gone. He was not a person given to emotional display, and he was not experiencing one now. What he was experiencing was the particular clarity that comes after a decision has been made and there is nothing left to do but follow through on it. He opened his phone and asked the branch assistant to locate a contact number for me from the account records. I was home when the call came, but I had changed out of my jacket and was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent 3 years working, with a glass of water in front of me that I had poured and not yet drunk. The number on the screen was the bank's main branch line. I almost didn't answer. I answered. The man on the other end introduced himself as Robert Thompson, regional director. He said he had been present in the branch that morning and had witnessed the full interaction, and he said he had spent the past several hours verifying the check and had confirmed through multiple channels, including direct contact with the issuing company, that the instrument was completely legitimate. He told me that the manager responsible had been suspended pending a formal review, and that, based on what the review had already uncovered, the outcome was not in question, and he said he was calling to personally apologize and to ask me to come back to the branch so that everything could be resolved properly. I listened to all of this without speaking. When Robert finished, I said I understood. Robert asked if I would be willing to come in the following morning. I said I would think about it. Then I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The glass of water was still in front of me. The two halves of the check were on the table now. I had taken them out of my pocket when I came home, unfolded them, and set them down. And there they were, my name, the company's name, the amount, all of it intact except for the clean tear running down the middle. I was not angry at Robert Thompson. The man had done what needed to be done, and he had done it quickly, and that was more than I had expected from any institution by the end of a day like this one. And what I was turning over was something else entirely. Going back meant walking through that door again. It meant standing in that branch at one of those desks among the people who had been there that morning, some of whom would still be there tomorrow, who had watched and said nothing, and would now have to look at me again. It meant allowing the resolution to happen in the same building where the damage had happened, as though the building itself were neutral, as though the space could simply be reset. I was not sure I owed the institution that. But then I thought about what the alternative actually was. Not going back was not a form of dignity. It was just an absence. The work I had done over 3 years, the late nights, the rebuilt architecture, the system that now ran quietly in the background of other people's financial lives, that work existed regardless of what Susan Morgan had believed about me when she looked at my jacket. And the check was real. My name was on it. I had earned it by doing something that was genuinely difficult. And the fact that a woman behind a desk had decided otherwise did not change the underlying truth of any of it. What I wanted was not to prove anything. What I wanted was simply to complete what I had come to do, to deposit the check, to close the transaction, to walk out of that branch having received exactly what I was owed, not more, not less, and then go home. And that was not weakness. That was finishing. I picked up the 2 pieces of the check from the table and held them together so that the tear aligned and the document read whole again. Then I set them back down, got up, and rinsed my glass in the sink. I would go back in the morning. I wore the same jacket. I had considered this the night before, not for long, but I had considered it. There was a part of me that understood the instinct to dress differently, to arrive in something that would make it harder for anyone to look at me the way Susan Morgan had looked at me. But that instinct, when I examined it honestly, was not about self-respect. It was about performing a version of myself designed to make other people comfortable, which was a performance I had been declining to give for most of my adult life. The jacket was clean. It fit. It was what I wore. I drove to the branch in the same gray morning light as the day before. I found a parking spot on the same block. I got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not because I was hesitating, but because I was being deliberate, which was different. Then I walked to the door. Robert Thompson was standing just inside the entrance. He was not pretending to be doing something else. He was not holding a coffee cup or looking at his phone. He was simply standing there facing the door, waiting. When I pushed through the entrance, Robert took 2 steps forward to meet me. The branch was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that moves through a room when something is about to happen that everyone present understands on some level to be significant. A teller who had been there the day before kept her eyes on her screen. A customer service associate near the far wall straightened in her chair. No one spoke. Robert extended his hand. I took it. The handshake was firm and unhurried, the kind that communicates that the person giving it has thought about what it means. Robert held my hand for exactly long enough to make clear that this was not a formality. And then he said one word, "Sir." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The word was spoken at a normal conversational volume, and it carried anyway, carried the length of the branch, or at least it seemed to in the way that certain words do when they arrive in the right silence. It was not an apology, and it was not a speech. It was something more precise than either of those things, a form of address, a title, an acknowledgement of exactly who was standing there and what that person was owed. I gave a single nod. Robert said, "Thank you for coming back. Let's take care of everything." He led me to a desk near the back of the branch. Not Susan Morgan's desk, which sat empty and cleared, its surface bare in a way that said more than any announcement could have, but a larger desk along the sidewall that belonged to a senior customer service officer named Carolyn Brooks. Carolyn was in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a directness about her that I found, after the past day, genuinely reassuring. She had a folder on the desk in front of her that she had clearly already prepared. Robert introduced us briefly and then remained standing nearby while Carolyn walked me through what would happen. The original check had been destroyed on bank premises by a bank employee. That created a specific remediation process. Carolyn had already been in contact with the Boston firm that morning before I had even arrived, and the firm had agreed to issue a replacement instrument immediately. The replacement would be sent electronically rather than by mail, which meant the bank could receive and process it that day. Given the circumstances, Robert had personally authorized an expedited clearance process so that the funds would not be subject to the standard multi-day hold that would normally apply to an instrument of that size. I listened, asked 2 clarifying questions about the timeline and the documentation I would receive, and signed where Carolyn indicated. The whole process took less than 40 minutes, and at no point did I have to raise my voice. At no point did I have to explain myself. At no point did anyone look at my jacket. When it was done, Carolyn shook my hand and told me I would receive written confirmation by the end of business. Robert walked with me toward the exit. Near the door, Robert said, "I want you to know that the review concluded this morning. Ms. Morgan's employment with the bank has been terminated." He said it plainly, without ceremony. The grounds were discriminatory conduct and deliberate destruction of a customer's financial instrument. Both findings were supported by camera footage and documentation. He let that sit for a moment, then added, "I also want you to know that the decision wasn't made to protect the bank. It was made because what happened to you was wrong, and institutions that don't act on that don't deserve the word." I looked at him. "I appreciate you saying that." I meant it. And I also understood that Robert was a person operating inside an institution, and that institutions have limits, and that what had happened the day before would not be the last time something like it happened somewhere. Robert Thompson was not the solution to a problem that was larger than any single branch or any single decision. He was one person who had seen something and chosen to act on it, and I was willing to give him full credit for exactly that. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The morning had cleared slightly since I had arrived, not warm, but brighter. The kind of late autumn light that doesn't offer heat, but at least offers visibility. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the 2 halves of the check. I had kept them, not out of anger and not as evidence, but because they were mine. My name was on them. 3 years of work were on them. Whatever judgment Susan Morgan had made in the 2 seconds between seeing the number and seeing my face, the document itself had never stopped being what it was. I held the 2 pieces together so that the tear aligned, the way I had done at the kitchen table the night before. The check was still completely legible. The numbers were still there. My name was still there. I thought about that conference room, the meeting I had not been in, as I could not have been in, but could reconstruct clearly enough from the shape of what Robert had told me, the file on the table, the question that had no good answer, and the silence that had followed it. I understood that silence. I had lived adjacent to that silence my entire life, the silence of people who knew somewhere beneath their reasoning that if you stripped away the assumptions and looked only at the facts, they could not defend what they had done. That silence was not nothing, and in its own way, it was a confession. I folded the 2 halves of the check once and put them back in my pocket. I thought I might keep them for a while, not on display, not as a monument to the worst 20 minutes of the past 3 years, but somewhere in a drawer in the apartment, in the kitchen. Maybe a reminder of the specific nature of a particular day, the kind of thing you keep not because you want to relive it, but because you want to remember clearly and without revision that you came through it without becoming smaller. I started the car. I got home before noon. The apartment was quiet. My daughter was at school. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. The table still clear except for a coffee mug I had rinsed and not yet put away. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. This room where I had worked for 3 years, the second monitor, the cold coffee, the hum of the refrigerator, was also the place where the work had happened, where the late nights had accumulated into something, where the invisible thing I had built had taken shape in the dark while the city slept. I pulled out a chair and sat down. On my phone, I had 2 messages from the Boston firm's legal contact, forwarded automatically as part of the remediation documentation. The replacement check had already been processed electronically. Carolyn Brooks had sent a confirmation email with the transaction reference number. The funds were in transit. I set the phone on the table. There were things I had told myself over the 3 years that I would do when the money came through. Not extravagant things. I was not a person who had ever organized his life around extravagance, but there were things I had put on hold because they required resources I hadn't had, and now I would have them. And the fact of that was beginning to settle in with a quiet weight that felt slowly and carefully like something real. My daughter had a gift, not just in the way that every parent believes their child has a gift, but in the verifiable way that had been flagged by 2 of her teachers in the past year and a half. It made people who paid attention to such things stop and take notice. There was a school, a serious school with a serious program that I had looked into quietly without mentioning it to her, because I had not wanted to name a possibility that I wasn't sure yet I could make real. I was sure now. I got up and put the coffee mug away. Outside, a car went past. A neighbor's door opened and closed somewhere down the hall. The refrigerator hummed. The apartment held the ordinary sounds of a morning, unremarkable and familiar. And I, David Harlan, stood in my kitchen in my worn navy jacket with the frayed left cuff and felt with a steadiness that had taken a long time to earn entirely like myself. I had gone in to deposit a check. I had deposited the check. That was what had happened, and the rest of it, the bench on the sidewalk, the torn pieces in my pocket, the room full of people who had looked away, the words spoken at the door by a man who had chosen to say it, all of it was the story around the fact. The fact was simple. The work had been real. The payment had been real. And no one had ultimately been able to change that. I had known they wouldn't be able to. I had always known. If you made it to the end of this story, as you already know, it isn't really about a check. It's about what happens when a system looks at a person and decides before a single fact has been examined who that person is allowed to be. It's about the room that goes quiet and stays quiet. It's about the particular exhaustion of having to be calm in a moment that does not deserve your calm and choosing to be anyway. Not because the situation has earned it, but because your dignity belongs to you and not to the situation. Now I am a fictional character, but the experience at the center of this story is not fiction for a lot of people. The assumptions made about a man based on his appearance, the institutional silence of bystanders, the weight of having to prove something that should never have required proof. These are real, and they happen in ordinary places on ordinary mornings, to people who are simply trying to complete a transaction and go home. A Robert Thompson matters in this story not because he fixed everything. He didn't, but because he saw something, understood what it meant, and chose not to look away. That choice is available to more people than act on it. You don't have to be a regional director to make it. I sat there in my kitchen that morning after everything, the 2 halves of the check still on the table, and felt a wave of something deep and raw wash over me. For 3 long years I had poured everything I had into that invisible work, late nights, cold coffee, quiet sacrifices so my daughter could sleep. And still, one glance at my worn jacket and tired eyes was enough for someone to tear it all apart like it meant nothing. The real lesson that hit me hardest wasn't just about the money or the bank. It was about the quiet, stubborn dignity we have to fight for when the world decides who we are before we even open our mouth. I learned that true worth isn't worn on the outside like some fancy suit. It lives in the steady choices you make when no one's watching, in the calm you choose when every part of you wants to scream. That silence in the branch that day, all those eyes looking away, it broke something in me for a moment, but it also showed me the power of one person who refuses to look away. Robert Thompson didn't have to step in, yet he did, proving that courage isn't loud or flashy. It's simply choosing to do what's right even when it costs you nothing. And me? I went back wearing the same jacket because my dignity wasn't something I had to dress up for anyone. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel small because of how you look or where you come from, I hope this story wraps around your heart like it did mine. You are not your jacket. You are the years of unseen work, the love you protect, the man or woman who keeps showing up. Your value is never up for debate. If this touched something deep inside you, tell me in the comments. What's the hardest moment you ever had to stand tall through? Share your story. Let's remind each other we're not alone. And if stories like this light a fire in you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so we can keep walking through these real, raw lessons together. Your support means everything.